All right, this is another episode 2 of Technicality. I'm Joanne Yao, and this is my esteemed co-host, Jordan Boyd.
Esteemed, thank you so much.
Yes.
That's cool.
Well, how are you doing on this another freezing cold day? You can't tell by the t-shirt, though. Are you
it's
warm enough?
I mean, it's warmer. I mean, I wouldn't say Zane and I had this conversation as we got out of the car. In the sun, it's not that bad.
So you're greenhousing your cars to stay warm? Is that the strategy?
Stay out of the wind, direct wind.
Right.
Stay out of it. Direct wind and shade.
Ah.
Yeah, if you don't have direct sunlight and have direct wind, you're going to be cold.
Wow. All right.
If you have direct sunlight, you'll be good.
Well, thank you for our winter safety and survival tips from Jordan Boyd.
Yeah, could be the weather guy too. We could have a new segment.
You know more than just talking tech then, do ya?
Oh, that's what I was going to say. Last time I kind of made it like you're the Nicality and I'm the tech. Really, I think we're both the tech and the Nicality.
Can't have one without the other.
Also, made a statement last time that you were providing legal advice, and what I meant to say is you aren't providing legal advice. You're providing your opinion on legal matters.
Personal opinions, as
Exactly.
you know, since we've known each other for a while, I am quite opinionated in the legal realm or otherwise.
Yeah, only the legal realm.
Yeah, but it was our first episode. We all say things that we think are going to sound really good. You know, it's like the inside voice sounds really good, and then you hear it through the outside voice, and you think, that wasn't such a good idea. So,
And it's roll up the rim. That's an exciting, I don't actually do it, but I'll never go back. Today it was just convenient. I was on the way. Usually I'm a Starbucks guy, but.
Well, if there's any Canada-wide corporation that wants to be one of our sponsors,
oh wow,
I'd love to talk to them about that because
Tim's or Starbucks?
Any of them.
Oh,
we can get them both. Why wouldn't we have them both?
That's a good point. Why would we turn down either? Yeah. I mean, I'd prefer Starbucks, just throwing it out there.
Well, what if Amazon approached you and said, listen, we're having some rocky PR times. We'd like to get some.
I will green screen in any brand. You will not be able to tell what brand this is. I'll just green screen in Amazon's logo. Masuk Law, Advos, whoever. Anyways, what are we talking about today? What's going on?
Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about something that you may have been more well read about than I. Yes. Relating to a topic we addressed last week, right? We talked about the Bezos divorce, and I think we might have mentioned something about these text messages that leaked, and preliminarily it was suspected that it was the brother of Bezos' mistress who might have leaked certain text messages, but I have been remiss in that I have not been following the story. You have, so maybe we can get a recap of the current events, and you can shoot me the best questions you got. If you got any, we can talk and discuss, and you can show me how little I know about this developing story.
Well, first of all, you kind of broke the news. I mean, I don't think I'd heard of the texts yet when you said that, and I was like, oh, okay. And then it turns out that there's a much bigger story around this. And so on February 7th, which was, what is that?
It's 4 days ago?
4 days ago. 4 days ago, Jeff Bezos published a blog post on Medium, which I thought was an interesting choice, but he probably owns some of it or something. And the title was "No Thank You, Mr. Pecker."
That was actually the title.
That is actually the title. And then the subsequent headlines due to this article were Bezos exposes Pecker, which is Mr. Pecker, not, anyways. So
that's Mr. Pecker to you, is that it?
References to a Pecker in this story. But anyways, there's a couple Peckers. Let's just leave it at that.
Okay.
So essentially what happened was Jeff Bezos received an email, I believe from the legal counsel for AMI. AMI owns the National Enquirer. AMI has been in the heat of all of these Trump allegations.
Yeah.
They basically got an immunity deal with Mueller because they provided information that I think essentially confirmed that Trump used them in a sense to pay off these two porn stars to so that they just buried their stories instead of publishing them. So they kind of misled these women to think that they were going to have their stories published, and then essentially just buried the stories right before the election happened. So AMI has already been kind of in the news. And Mr. Pecker supposedly is a longtime friend of Donald Trump's. So essentially...
Wait a second. Let me get this straight.
Okay.
So we have...
It's complicated.
Trump, Pecker, porn stars.
Yeah. That's... So National Enquirer.
National Enquirer.
That's how that's all. They own AMI is the publishing company or the head of...
Okay.
National
And
Enquirer.
am I going to be mistaken in thinking that National Enquirer is not going to be represented as some authoritative media source? Because in my mind, that's when I see the National Enquirer, I'm not seeing very credible stories anyway. I think aren't they the ones who put out Bat Boy developments, and they've been following Bat Boy's appearances for the last 30 years?
I think
is that them?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that the National Enquirer's like a tabloid. But I mean, so is every other People magazine. Like, they're all tabloids, really, right? So I think Middle America reads National Enquirer. Okay. Would be my guess.
Okay. All right. Go on. I'm sorry I interrupted. I just wanted to get some context as far as, is it going to be a National Enquirer credibility issue?
I would say they have relatively credible sources, but I think they play this extortion-y game, which we'll get into. So basically, he gets this email, and it says, we published this first story saying we have texts from this mistress. We also have additional assets, if you will, which they list. And I'm not going to read them all because a lot of them are weird, and I don't want to read them. I'll read a couple though.
Okay.
A shirtless Mr. Bezos holding his phone in his left hand while wearing his wedding ring. He's wearing either a tight black cargo pant or shorts, and his semi-erect manhood is penetrating the zipper of said garment. So they basically list out all of these pictures and things they have on him, and say pretty much, in order for us to not release these, we want the Washington Post, which Jeff Bezos owns, to stop running bad coverage on AMI as well as Trump.
Yeah.
And what Bezos is asserting in this is he feels that the Saudi angle, which is the Jamal Khashoggi murder, with the journalist that got murdered in Saudi Arabia in the embassy, which they tried to cover up, and it was clearly a lie. MBS, who's the leader of Saudi Arabia, clearly orchestrated this murder basically in their own consulate. I mean, that whole thing's insane. But what they were saying is Pecker went to a meeting at the White House or at Trump Tower where one of the Saudi officials was also at that meeting. And basically, in a nutshell, they're saying that the Saudis basically said, you need to kind of threaten these guys or do something about it. That's what Bezos is asserting. And then the other assertion that kind of came out of it was that the means by which they obtained these materials. So the photos, the text, all this stuff. So what's being asserted by the lawyer for Mr. Pecker is that the photos were obtained by Ms. Sanchez's brother.
Okay.
Which, I mean, I don't know. It doesn't make a ton of sense to me how that would be possible. Just knowing how iPhones work, I'm assuming Bezos uses an iPhone because they're encrypted and stuff. But anyways, so then there's an assertion from Bezos that potentially an allegation that Trump utilized the state, utilized the government to hack these materials from Bezos.
Okay.
So the large story here is it seems like Bezos is kind of going after AMI to try and take them out. Yeah. Because he doesn't like what they're trying to expose. But then even larger than that, maybe, if it's true that Trump used the state's power to hack a citizen, it would be immediate impeachment.
Wow, absolutely.
For Trump. So there's a lot of layers to it. That's kind of it in a nutshell. And now there's a federal investigation going on into AMI because of this. They're suggesting, and by the way, the terms of the immunity agreement between AMI and the Mueller investigation was like they couldn't commit a crime for 3 years or something. Which I thought was fascinating, like that you have to agree to not do that. Like that's not an assumed.
Yeah, that's not the first time I've heard. That's not the first time I've heard someone say that. For instance, being on probation means you can't commit a crime for a certain period of time. And I know that seems counterintuitive because you would think logically, well, you shouldn't commit a crime ever. But in the little bit of criminal defense that I did do, it's quite common that for the terms of your probation or any kind of similar situation that you, bad guy, you are not allowed to commit crimes. Otherwise, we will fully enact all and we'll just unleash criminal sanction fury on you. So even though the regular, average, everyday person would think that, well, I'm just not going to commit crimes for my entire lifetime. For some situations, I can see where there would be, and it sounds ridiculous, the clause that thou shalt not commit a crime for this period of time.
Right.
But it usually triggers enhanced penalties or penalties that have been withheld pending someone's good behavior.
Right.
Interesting, though.
Well, and I think so. There's two like legal angles to this.
Yeah.
In my opinion, the first is like, is this extortion against Bezos? Is this extortion? And then, and basically what their lawyer is saying for Pecker, he's basically saying, look, we had these materials, so it was whether we would run, one story or five. And so we basically said, look, we won't run these if you don't do this. Right. So they're trying to say, look, we were just, having a bargain, some type of bargain agreement where, we don't do this, you don't do that.
Right.
Whereas obviously Bezos is trying to say this is extortion.
Right.
So that's the first one. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, let me first ask this. I don't know that there's been any in criminal investigations as far as extortion. And the reason why I ask that is because I think if there were criminal investigations, that would just blow up the media. Even though my head was in the sand for the last few days, I'm sure I would have heard that headline. So
as far as I know, the feds are investigating.
They are investigating, are they?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know that it rises to the level of extortion, and I'd have to look into that further. However, what I can say is that I'm quite sure that this rises to some level of violating journalistic ethics. I mean, the whole crux of journalism is to provide a story that's clear and unbiased and to inform the public, without any personal influences hidden inside. Like, there's no personal agenda of the reporters, of the media, of any kind of outlet. It's just, these are the facts, this is what happens. So to motivate someone to do anything in the interest of putting a media spin on it, that's surely some kind of violation of journalistic ethics. Right. And again, I haven't taken a day of journalism, but I think that it strikes anybody as far as what they would expect out of news, even in this context and the environment of fake news and all. I think everyone still has some expectation that if they're getting news, it's going to be clear and unbiased, and it doesn't forward an agenda.
It seems kind of blackmail-y to me.
Yeah.
And I don't know the law, but I mean, it's like we have photos of you naked or whatever with your wedding ring on, or texts between this mistress that essentially, and by the way, that's why Bezos and his wife announced it, because AMI broke the story that he had a mistress. So that's what triggered him to announce.
Wow.
Was the Inquirer story.
Well, let me ask you this then. I'm going to turn the table on you as the head of a tech company. How does that strike you as far as his strategy? How did he handle that from a business perspective and a PR perspective, and particularly since marketing and all that? What do you think of his decision to do that?
I think it was smart. I think so basically what happened right after he put it out is a few other high-profile journalists like Ronan Farrow, who's sort of been the head of the Me Too kind of breaks and stuff. Ronan Farrow came out and said he's been threatened by AMI. The Daily Beast, which is another publication, came out and said they've been threatened by the AMI. And a third one, the AP, came out and said we've also been threatened. The Associated Press have been threatened. Our journalists have been threatened. So I think he exposed Pecker, right? And I think that was probably the smartest thing, because now it's kicked off this Fed investigation of, should they have immunity if they're going around blackmailing people? And by the way, the Sanchez brother, that released these documents, which they're claiming, AMI is claiming he's been a source for them for 7+ years or something. And so that's why it's also not blackmail, because both Ms. Sanchez and Mr. Bezos know him. So it's like a mutual friend. But the brother came out and said that Trump had asked for this hit job, basically, against Bezos. Right. Because of the coverage from the Washington Post, because of the Jamal Khashoggi stuff, and because Trump did nothing about it. So, I mean, I think this was smart. I think what he basically said is, look, they might print this stuff anyways, so what do I have to lose? I mean, people might see these photos of me, so, I might as well drag them down with me.
Well, I mean, right? The alternative, if we really wanted to protect everyone from any kind of exposure, which, I don't know if you're ready to move on to the next segment where we talk about censorship from the government, and
right.
where we have governments controlling what content their people are getting, particularly China. China's, I don't want to use the word notorious, because I think some proponents of what they're doing is that some people really support it because they believe it protects morals and values and political systems, and others really they really take issue with it because the rest of the world is speaking freely and having free access to various pieces of information, whereas an entire country, and when you think about the power, the economic power that if China doesn't already have it, it's going to have in the very near future. And
I think the Saudi angle here is important too, by the way, because the Saudi government's one of the worst for censoring the public, right? And executing people, like beheading people still in the streets. They still behead people in Saudi Arabia, if anyone doesn't know that. It's kind of terrifying. And people go and watch still. Like, it's still a thing that you can go and watch people be beheaded. So Hassan Minhaj, who has a show on Netflix, did an episode on MBS, who's the leader of Saudi Arabia, criticizing him for the Jamal Khashoggi stuff, for the murder. Right. And that it's so obvious that he did it. MBS's people reached out to Netflix and basically said, take that down in Saudi Arabia, and got it taken down. So they used a vague censorship law that's like, you can't go against the values and the, like you just said, the values and the, whatever of our religion. So they had it taken down. And I think what's interesting about that case specifically is, as more of these social networks go into these sort of censored countries, what's going to be the precedent for how easily they can take stuff down? For example, on Netflix that criticizes their government, when people in that country should be able to hear other perspectives on their government. Sure. So, that example where they took down that Netflix episode is a little scary, right? Because it just shows they can cite a little tiny law, which they use to cite all the time to silence teenagers and other people that are protesting against them and kill them and end their lives, right? So, but then that ties into China, like you said. I think that ties in to China, where they don't have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp. I mean, anything owned by Facebook. Right. They don't have any of that. They don't have Google. That's the other one. Even though I think Google's been working on a censored version of their search for China, but that's a whole nother day maybe. That came out in the government questioning of the Google CEO. Okay. But what China's doing is even crazier. China's basically doing real-time censorship. So China's big ones like WeChat, Weibo, there's a couple other ones, and they're all kind of monitored constantly by the government. And China will actually censor entire terms, like roll up your sleeves. Like, they'll do entire terms that they'll just take that out of what's available on the internet. Okay. They'll also remove chunks of history, such as Tiananmen Square. Right. So part of Hassan Minhaj's episode, he shows clips, and I've seen these kind of clips before, where they go to, there's like a journalist in China, and they ask teenagers, what did you learn about Tiananmen Square in school? And they look at them like, we didn't learn about it. So it's almost like Hassan compares it to people not knowing about 9/11 in America, right? Like not learning about that. So, but to your point, in China, there is this angle of why does it matter? Like they're very much more liberal about their data privacy.
Right. Well, and I mean, data and privacy there's so many conflicting perspectives that I know that there have been global efforts to harmonize privacy and those kinds of laws, because, I mean, really, what's privacy in one country where information just moves so freely across the world? And I think there's a lot of conflict because privacy has to do with, at the most fundamental level, your own autonomy, your ability to choose what's done with your data, what's collected about you, and how is it being used. So, there's been a line of inquiries about whether people's right to be forgotten is almost too freely exercised. And there's a UK publisher, The Telegraph, who has a whole list of newsworthy articles that basically report on essential happenings in the community. So, for instance, there was one story that strikes out to me is there was a really brief news story, I want to say it was in the early 2000s, about this kid who he's a teenage menace. Like, he, in this tiny town that he lived in, he caused like 40% of the crimes in his community, and it was like tearing down property. The article suggested that he assaulted like a 15-year-old girl, and she was sent to the hospital. His own parents or his own father called the police on him because he was just tearing down his own home. So there was, the courts had issued the equivalent of a restraining order on him. And I want to say the UK version of it was called the ARBO, ARBO. But it's essentially a restraining order that says this person's a menace to society. Just, everybody beware. But lo and behold, about 7 years after that, he was able to, and the procedure for doing this is not disclosed, but he was able to somehow get that story taken down. So people who would look for this kid's name, they were unable to find that story. But the interesting aspect of this is because that legislation was only in the UK, if someone used Google UK to try and look for this kid in the story, they wouldn't find it at all. It's been de-indexed. But if that same person in the UK went through google.com and did the exact same search, they would be able to find it. So, and so that kind of strikes an interesting question about, what exactly are we protecting people from? And if we're going to do that, are we even doing it in a way that's meaningful? Yeah. So, I mean, back to your point about the fact that information is, like, these kids are not learning these historical and monumental moments. I just fail to see what exactly are we protecting them from, or what exactly is their government protecting them from.
And what happens when they travel to Canada or America, which I know a lot of Chinese people love to do, right? And I've been to China. I mean, I love China. And I didn't ever try to do any of those like Google or Facebook. I mean, it was smaller, dating myself a little, right? But it was smaller at the time when I was there. But there was certainly there's definitely a tension between taking you can't take photos of police or of government things. Like, even if a guard is standing in the square, you can't take photos of it. So there's like a certain level of tension there, but I never found it was super sketchy. But I think what's interesting about this story is how what really started to shift this is the Me Too movement in China. Okay, yeah. Right? And so what started happening is the Me Too movement took over in China, and obviously just like in Canada, the US, and other places, it's a huge issue there. There's a lot of surveys that say a lot of women get sexually harassed on the train because they take the train a lot. So there's some very specific community based things that are happening specifically in China, right? Yeah. So at first the government was like, no, take it all down, block it all. None of this Me Too stuff. We don't like this.
We don't like this, therefore it should be taken down.
Right. Yeah. We don't like where this is going. But then I guess because of so much political pressure from the people, which is really awesome to see, right? Because it is a communist government. I think people are very afraid to go against them. They basically use the founding values of the party that's in power, President Yi, his founding values, which has to do with equality.
Yeah.
And that women are equal. And so they've started kind of pushing that on them, and the Communist Party started going, oh crap, I think they've got us here. And so my understanding is the first ever reported case, which is kind of crazy to think about, like, because it's obviously not the first case, was reported on January 1st, 2018 in China. And it was against this really famous, that one was a professor who was sexually harassed by someone. And then it led to this sort of bigger one with this game show host guy, Zhu Jun. And now what's looking like is happening is they're now creating laws to protect women against sexual harassment. So it actually kind of got through this censorship, which is interesting. If you compare China and Saudi Arabia, it seems like, at least from this, that China is a bit more progressive and a bit more in tune. They have their finger a bit closer to the pulse of the people of China and what they want.
Right.
And they're not just going to let religion or, super old, archaic values keep going forward.
Well, I'd have to think as well, too. I mean, with what you said about how fluid people can move around the globe, that there's got to be some level of like feeling betrayed that if people who've been living in a censored environment and they get out of that environment and they speak with other people and they discover, wow, all these events happened, we never even heard about it, and it happened right in our own country. I would suspect that it's kind of like you can't shelter, like you can't protect a kid from the outside world forever. You just can't.
Well, including outside news, right? I mean,
right.
Anyone in China, as far as I know, I'm sure sees the Me Too stuff happening in the States. Mm-hmm. And Saudi Arabia is similar with, like, they allowed women to drive finally. Yeah. Which is just, again, an insane thing to think about. But to me, it does seem like China is kind of a little bit smarter about navigating the political landscape of laws and this stuff. Now, as far as I know, there still has not been a actual sexual harassment lawsuit or case in China.
Okay.
This Zhu Jun one could be the first one ever.
Wow.
Which is crazy to think about, right? That still hasn't happened, but will happen, which is, it could open a floodgate for that movement to kind of happen in China, which, similar to US and Canada, probably leads to a lot of change in how people think about interacting with women in the workplace or wherever else, right?
Well, it'll be interesting to watch the developments in that, because especially with the cultural differences, I wonder how the concept of sexual harassment will be treated in a different cultural environment. So, within Canada and US, we think of, all right, there's two parts to sexual harassment. It's did the sexual harassment actually happen? And if it's determined that it did happen, phase 2 is, all right, what's the punishment? And when we even talk about punishment, I use the term punishment loosely because there's a lot of legal theory and discussion over the philosophy of what do we do when someone wrongs somebody else, particularly in a criminal matter. Is the consequence to punish that person? Is it to deter it from ever happening again, either by that person or by society in a whole? Is it to somehow compensate the plaintiff or the victim, I should say? So there's, even if this is the first sexual harassment case in all of China, I'd be interested to see how they develop that framework.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to ask you, you said you speak a little bit of Cantonese.
Cantonese, yeah.
So they keep trying to figure out ways to get around the censors.
Okay.
The people in China, right? Because they're so one of the ways they started thinking about was with emojis. Okay. So my understanding is that mi means rice, or the character
Mai.
for me,
Yes.
Mai.
Okay.
And 2, the symbol means bunny.
To. Oh yeah.
So they started using the rice and bunny emoji, hashtag rice bunny. So they had rice. It was like rice bunny was their whole. Anyways, I thought that was kind of awesome that they used.
That is clever.
They were even using, which I won't even get into. As you know, blockchain is a nightmare to even
Oh yeah.
try and help people understand. But they were even using blockchain so that these stories couldn't be taken down. So they were trying to hide, like trying to kind of hide them.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was cool. But good for China.
Yeah.
For stepping up. Tisk Saudi Arabia for stepping down. And the funny thing was too on that show that there's a ton of videos on Netflix. Like Netflix is available in Saudi Arabia. There's a ton of shows, cooking shows with pork references and.
So which on religious basis, those would be blasphemous?
I mean, I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Or you
right.
shouldn't, but they're not going to watch them. So why wouldn't you take those down? And then there's also another episode of Hassan's show where he does criticize MBS that they didn't get. So that's like, there's one that he does and they took the other one down.
Yeah.
The Jamal Khashoggi one is what really bothers them, which again is what's makes this whole Bezos thing sketchy, right? Because it obviously bothers them a lot.
Right.
That Jamal Khashoggi thing is just in their nerve. And then also just shows about devil worshipping and stuff on Netflix, like Sabrina the Teenage Witch and other weird shows.
Yeah, I
They're
can't
basically
imagine
like,
that.
how do those stay up? And anyways.
Yeah, but I guess another interesting perspective on that would be the very nuanced way to interpret consent, because as we know, consent sometimes is confusing even per individual. You know, consent in one scenario may not be the same as consent in a different scenario. So how do we then define consent across borders and treat it the same way? Because again, sexual harassment would probably have its own cultural connotations. I wonder how consent would be taken there. You know, those types of relationships, when it comes to somebody making advances on somebody else, you know, how do we?
I would guess consent's relatively universal, but maybe, I mean, I could see there'd be cultural nuances to it, but.
And but would there be that kind of value? I mean, in the Western, the North American version of consent it basically says it has to be very clear that this is consent and this is not consent, and they even take into consideration if somebody is too intoxicated to provide consent. So that's
those waters get muddy fast.
Yeah, absolutely.
Especially in America.
Yeah, especially in America.
Yeah,
where lawyers abound, because that's what they do best, is cutting the pie a million ways to one, and then deciding that they don't want to cut it at all.
What I hope doesn't happen in China, which I think has happened a bit in the States, and we've seen it get a little out of control, is the sort of the bad side effect of Me Too, which is that you're guilty before you have your trial, or before you have any type of ability to defend yourself. And there's even been a lot of universities that have settled with male students over kind of kicking them out of the school and doing a bunch of stuff, and then it kind of not being found to be necessarily true. Now, that's not to say the movement itself isn't extremely valuable and amazing. I just think there's been some offshoots of, if someone says it, you're guilty. Or if someone had a bad date, for example. I've seen this happen in celebrities specifically.
Sure.
Someone has a bad date, or someone has a bad experience with someone that was not as comfortable as they wanted. Yeah. And they kind of go, well, that was sexual harassment.
Well, I was.
So it's like it gets real gray. I feel.
I mean, I was surprised, but not surprised, even when the Brett Kavanaugh issues was.
That was a bit of a hit job.
But still, I think even in the very early stages, there was a lot of controversy over are we giving the procedures that are in place a fair enough opportunity to determine whether he did what he was alleged to have done, and his reputation was attacked, and it was because he's essentially a public figure and going for a very, very high position. I mean, the Supreme Court.
Legal position.
Yeah, so.
You have to have moral judgment. Yeah.
So you're right about that, and I mean, wherever you stand on the Kavanaugh issue, what you just said, I'm quite dismayed that conclusions were drawn based solely on accusations. Even
there's still people
regardless.
that think he's a rapist.
And that's the thing, is that
but there's no proof that he's a rapist. There's one person who, and then there was these other ones that kind of got muddied and I don't think were true. But one person from, what was it, 30 years?
Yeah, 30 years prior. She went to law school with him, I
A
believe.
long time
Sure.
before, right? I mean, that's like, how often do people forget stuff in criminal trials? Like memories,
any kind of trial, sure, yeah.
Like that's why they say when they're like, oh, the bad guy looked like this, and it's like almost always wrong because people don't remember stuff correctly. That one specifically, I'm not saying in general.
Right.
That one specifically was basically her word versus his word and the other guy's word.
Right.
And no one else at the party remembered this stuff. No one else. She sort of mentioned it to her husband many, many, many years later.
Right.
No one else at the party remembered that happening. No one else at the party remembered being there.
Right.
There was a lot of inconsistencies at the end of the day that I felt I wasn't convinced that he did it or didn't do it. I wasn't, like I was kind of like, maybe he did it. Mm-hmm. But to say that the guy's,
well, and I think also there's a lot of other.
It's crazy.
And besides the Kavanaugh issue, I mean, in the wider scope, there still has to be consideration for if someone comes forward and says, well, this happened to me many decades ago. I think we still want to encourage those people to, regardless of how credible their memory is, to come out and say this is what happened and to have that level of at least initial credibility. But I think people muddy the waters too much when they take the step one aspect of I believe you and what you're saying.
He's guilty.
To number two, the second step, which is is he actually guilty of what he's done?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. No. I agree. I think no one should not come out. I just think people shouldn't be angry if we believe in the justice system.
Yeah.
People shouldn't be angry when there isn't enough evidence for a crime.
Right.
The same way you wouldn't want, the making a murderer people in jail if there isn't enough evidence that they murdered those. Like, it's the same thing. You would never say, well, because it's murder, it's different than sexual assault. Or I just feel like we need to hold them all the same. And the Me Too movement's amplified it a little bit to an extreme where people just want to virtue signal that kind of, let's believe her. Mm-hmm. Let's listen to her.
Yeah.
Like you said.
Yeah.
Believing her has to take evidence.
Right.
It has to. Just like any other type of criminal thing. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's what I would say. Right. But this brings us to our final topic.
Which parlays nicely because it has to do with consent as well.
Slightly different.
Yeah, in a different context.
Different consent, yeah.
In different context. So
give us the background.
Right. So I just found this really interesting article. And by article, I mean it was on the opinions section of the New York Times, and I think the title is rather fascinating. The title is "How Silicon Valley Puts the Con in Consent," and the basis of what this opinion has to say is that, and let me first read for you what's alleged to be fact in this. The opening sentence says the average person would have to spend 76 working days reading all of the digital privacy policies they agree to in the span of a year. Reading Amazon's terms and conditions alone out loud takes approximately 9 hours. So what this opinion is trying to say is, okay, the con in consent is that what are you really consenting to? You're not giving free and knowing consent. You just want to get through all this boilerplate garbage to get what you really want to get to, whether it's to buy something or participate in an app or to download something or whatever lays on the other side of that consent issue. So my perspective on this is, again, twofold. Number one is that these are long and boilerplate and horrible things to read because somewhere along the line, lawyers have had to get involved to try and anticipate absolutely anything and every situation that would come from what if we don't get someone's consent. So they're saying you consent to all these 1,000 scenarios, and these are all the ways we could slice the pie. Now, on the other hand, I feel like if you're going to get someone's free and voluntary and knowing consent, it should be pretty straightforward. And I'm drawing this on my experience in reviewing and scrutinizing consent forms when you go to see a doctor or get any kind of medical care. It's that if you don't know what you're consenting to, then it's not knowing consent. You don't even know what consent you're giving. And how can it be freely given if you don't know what it is? If someone just says, sign here, and you will receive this benefit of medical care or of whatever lays beyond the click here to agree. And then an additional layer to that is when you've got kids involved. And I know you got some opinions here when it comes to apps that require permission and consents, and if it involves a particular demographic like minors or other people who can't provide consent. So I'm interested to hear your take on this particular article.
Yeah, well, and this article kind of touches on two important points, and both I think are widely talked about in the tech world. One is terms and conditions. I mean, everyone knows they're terrible. There's sites that have like breakdowns of terms and conditions. I forget what it's called, but there's sites where you can kind of go to it and be like, and it gives you the Coles notes of or what it Coles notes, is that it? Cliff notes? Coles notes?
Yeah, I think it's Coles notes in Canada and Cliff notes for
right. So it gives you the breakdown, but you know, Jack Dorsey, founder of Twitter, was on Joe Rogan's podcast the other day, and Joe basically said, like, have you read the terms and conditions of Twitter? And he said yes, he has, but he's like, well, have you read Facebook's and Instagram's? And he was like, no. So I mean, even Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, doesn't read terms and conditions, really. I mean, that's what he's saying. He's read his own, hypothetically. So that's interesting, right? How do we, and I have some thoughts on how do you fix terms and conditions, because there's got to be a way to do that. The second issue is when it comes to people aged 13 to 18 or 13 to 17, do they understand what they're consenting to as much as someone who's 18 plus, right? And so recently Apple took a Facebook app out of the App Store, blocked it, and it became this huge kind of story in the tech world saying, you know, Apple blocks Facebook's app. And basically what the app does is you download it and it collects almost all the data on your phone versus just the app itself data. It collects all the data. So every time you look at it, every time you open it, every time you do anything, call, text, anything like that. And they were marketing this app to people through Snapchat, so they were marketing it to young people. And basically what they said was, look, for $20 a month, we'll pay you $20 a month if you just let us have all this data. So the argument they're saying is, like, does a 13-year-old who's probably like, wow, $20 a month, that's wicked. Do they really understand what they're giving up? And to be honest with you, I think paying people for their data, I think, is something that's going to continue to come up in the future as a potential way of either disrupting the current social networks or just making the current ones better.
Yeah.
By kind of saying, look, you know, we get it. We're making a lot of money from this and it's your data.
Right.
So how about we keep showing you the ads, but we give you some of the cut.
Yeah.
Like, I could see that being a thing. So I personally don't see that much of an issue. They basically had a consent box that's, you know, said you have to have your parents' consent, which could be argued that they could just not have their parents' consent and kind of do it on their own. But you know, overall, if someone's willing to pay for your data, there's this argument of, and I think people in China feel this way, if I'm not breaking any laws, what's the problem?
Right.
Like, why wouldn't I, kind of, what am I hiding if you know what I mean? So, and then there's other people that would say, never give them data, right? As soon as we give them data and access to data, then they'll just keep taking it until they know so much about us. Like they already do, right? They already know so much about us than we know about ourselves.
Yeah.
That's another thing I think they could let people have insight into, is their own personal decision-making processes and buying habits. Like Amazon could tell you that on Fridays at 2, you always, you have a higher propensity for purchasing new shoes.
I've heard that, and they want to tailor also that I know.
Specifically your reference.
I know it.
But then with the terms and conditions things, like I've thought about, like, how do you make terms and conditions. I think if they had some type of, like I said, there's websites that break down the key. Here's what you're really giving. If there was something like that, super digestible. Maybe it's even in a video format. I know it's a little weird, but maybe it could be a video that you watch. It's like a 2-minute video, a 1-minute video, whatever. And that's how you get through the terms and conditions. You watch this 1-minute video and it kind of clears things over a little bit better.
Yeah.
There's never going to be a way, like you said, for lawyers to not find 1.5 million ways for people to misuse the platform or misuse the data, or,
Right.
so that they're not going to get smaller. If anything, they're going to get longer, more complicated, more confusing over time, as more laws come into play, et cetera, et cetera.
Which I don't disagree with you there, and you've given me a lot to talk about right then and there. And this is why I like working with my clients on a one-on-one basis, the way I'm talking to you, and you and I are talking about these issues, because solving these problems is more than just for lawyers looking at what the regulations are, what the legislation is, comparing it across jurisdictions. It's going to be about how do we come up with a feasible solution that's workable. Okay, so one of the things you mentioned was how do we fix this problem? And far be it from me to have the easiest and maybe the most cost-effective solutions, but I think that we can follow, as far as the terms and conditions and getting consent, I think we can follow along a movement that's not. It's not brand new. It's probably, if I was to guess, maybe 15, 20 years in the making, when contracts used to have, like basic contracts, used to have horrible, archaic, old English words, like just words that you wouldn't, if you looked at it now, you wouldn't know what it meant. Yeah, thou. And I mean, there was one, and this is not in a contract, obviously, but there was, when I was looking at an affidavit, and it ended with like affiant further saith not. Yeah,
that's fun.
And I said, what? Somebody's supposed to be agreeing to this under oath? That's ridiculous. They don't even know what it means. So the movement has been to prepare contracts that are easy to read, that are easy to understand, that are shorter, that people can read and understand without the help of a lawyer. And I mean, as economically feasible as it will be for lawyers to do exactly what you say, is to make them really complex and make it difficult, and basically give ourselves some assurance of job security. Ethically, I think as lawyers, we should make it as easy as possible for people to give consent. So whether it is, as you said, videos that you have to watch and get through before you can click agree, or whether every time you click on something, there's going to be a pop-up that says, that by clicking on this, you're giving us this information, this is how we use it. I mean, none of that is going to be in the interest of commerce and capitalism, because it makes it harder for people to click yes, I want to buy this. But ultimately, if there's some general agreement to making things easier for people to understand what they're giving up, I think the movement has to get there. Okay, and as far as what you said about age of consent, so globally there's various debates about what's the age of consent, and it's deemed that, I mean, for the most part, at least Canada and the US, that somebody who's 12 years old, even though they say, yeah, of course I consent to having my data collected, they're not old enough to consent to that. If they entered into an agreement to buy a house or buy a car, I mean, sure, I mean, somebody could sell something to them, but if this was ever to be fought in or disputed in a court of law, the court's going to rewind that contract and say, no, this kid can't buy a car, this kid can't buy a house. What are you people thinking, trying to induce a young person to give up their rights, give up their money in order for you to make a buck? So that's not going to stand. I actually like what you're talking about, and I as unpalatable as it is right now for there to be a dollar value associated with data and data privacy, I draw the analogy to when bottled water first came out. And at first everyone said, man, people are crazy. If you're going to pay for why would you pay for bottled water? When it comes out of the faucet, it's free. But, then bottled water became the pristine standard because it was pristine, it was clean, and water that came out of the faucet was deemed dirty. And I think that's a useful analogy, because if the collection of data, if this process of participating in online purchases, in app downloads, if it's perceived as dirty, that people understand that their data can be misused for as innocent as the purposes may be, I think if people understand that there are sinister ways to to have data used. That not every gulp of water you take from the faucet is going to get you sick, but what if that one gulp does get you sick? That same analogy could be, what if that one transaction tears up your privacy, tears up your reputation? And I think maybe those safeguards could be worth money, and I think people would be willing to pay for it, unless it's killing turtles and is not biodegradable like bottled bottles for water is now.
Right.
But that's a whole other separate issue. So
yeah. Well, and just quickly on the sort of people understanding data and terms and conditions, I think I would put it more on the government or maybe private corporations, but data literacy. Right.
Yes.
I mean, let's educate kids and young, we never took any data privacy classes in university or high school. That should be a class. I mean, that's that's the age we live in. If you had data literacy classes and that movement started building, I think you'd see less issues around the terms and conditions, because people would be kind of fully transparent about what data they're already giving up, because they would understand what data is and how it's being used in a marketing context, in a business context. That's my final point. I know you have a meeting to kind of run to here. So,
thanks again for another wonderful episode. We'll see you guys again next week for episode 3.
Yeah, and I have some ideas. The one idea I have is there's this angle that Silicon Valley is tilted to the left and are censoring right-wing people and not censoring left-wing people. I think we should get into that debate next time.
All right, and a debate I'd like to get into, maybe not next time, but at some point, is tech in biology and medical health sciences. There's a lot going on in there as well, so I'd like your take on some of those issues.
Wicked.
All right, it's a wrap.
Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
TECHnicality. Subscribe.